question, how climate finance can be more tailored and made more accessible for local communities, local innovators, and especially small businesses. Climate finance is still an up-and-coming field. I think the first time it was introduced into the climate goals on a supranational level as part of the UN is only 6, 7 years ago. So there's still a lot of work being done to actually define what does it mean, what are different maybe instruments, vehicles, etc., because it's still developing and maturing. But I think something that we are seeing already now in the region is an effort to deconstruct a little bit climate finance as this overarching word or field, to now see how can it actually be trickled down to serve communities and to serve innovators and small businesses. And we know that in East Africa, looking at the climate space, still a lot of the entrepreneurs and innovators, they are in their early stages of development. They need capital, but they might need a kind of smaller amounts of capital than traditional investors or finance intermediaries such as banks, for example, provide. And so I think one core aspect is to think about what are innovative financing mechanisms within climate finance. So, for example, a blend between concessional finance, grants, concessional loans, for example, that can de-risk climate investments into local community projects, into innovators and small businesses that are in their early stages, to then really utilize this blended investments for the innovators to build some traction that can then actually crowd in more private investments and signal to private investors that actually these are really good investment choices. Of course, another interesting piece is to link the investments with climate outcomes. And there, I think the work is both to further structure what climate impact models can look like, and then also work very closely with innovators and small businesses to enable them to frame their work and the critical work that they're doing within these impact models to then unlock other climate finance mechanisms, such as, for example, carbon credits or more innovative financing that is slowly emerging. For example, we're running a program at the moment called the Circularity Launchpad that is supported by Andy and IKEA Foundation. And the goal of that program is really to bridge this gap between the Kenyan innovators and small businesses that drive impact in circularity and the impact investors and philanthropic investors who are interested in investing into climate innovations and startups, but still perceive it as quite risky. And so there is this financing gap that we are seeing that we're at the moment working on closing. So I think these are some of the ways climate finance can be made more accessible to local communities. And I think it's happening in pilots at smaller scale. And now it's really about also bringing it all together to maximize the impact and really enable the financial support for these innovators and small businesses that they need to have in order to really drive their impact in their business. I think community-driven solutions play an important role in effectively deploying climate finance to maximize impact, because they really understand the local realities on the ground. They deeply understand the problems that they're solving for, and therefore ensure ownership and agency of initiatives of innovations that then enable long-term sustainability and increased impact. And there's a lot of evidence of how community-driven solutions within the climate impact space in Kenya are really driving impact. For example, a pioneering initiative called Wildlife Works, that is looking at the wildlife corridor between Savo East and Savo West, that is really driving or is being driven by the communities living around there. They are owning that project and have developed over the last 10, 15 years since establishment, or even 20 years, I think, different channels of increased economic income, better education, better access to healthcare, etc., in combination with wildlife conservation. It is really, really interesting. So I think, and is as a result unlocking climate finance because of this innovative and really community anchored approach. I think across the country or across the region, one challenge is that often with different community-driven solutions, there's somewhat a fragmentation. So there's a solution here and here and here and here. So it's really difficult for larger climate finance institutions that want to just deploy kind of financing on a higher level to actually identify which solutions to invest in. And so there is a need for aggregation, and for intermediaries to then be able to actually invest in a portfolio of community-driven solutions rather than kind of these single solutions. I think another important point is also to look at existing distribution channels for finance and utilize them for climate finance. For example, through SACCOs, where you can really deploy climate finance in local currency to reach the last mile, to reach more rural communities as well. For example, by connecting traditional SACCO savings and credit activities, linking them to climate goals, such as, for example, offering green energy and clean cooking loans tailored to the members and households, so that, for example, micro enterprises who are then offering bioethanol, for example, or offering clean cooking solutions can then really build their businesses and access that climate financing through channels that they're already using rather than in parallel systems. So I think there's a huge role community-driven solutions play, and I think it's really important to channel climate financing through some of this infrastructure that already exists, that is already happening, but has potential, I think, for more scale, so to say, to really support these important solutions on the ground. I think design thinking and co-creation are critical approaches to access climate finance and also to effectively deploy it, actually, for innovators and entrepreneurs, but also actually for investors. I think on the side of innovators and entrepreneurs, it really strengthens the case for funding if entrepreneurs deploy design thinking and co-creation as tools to help them validate their innovations on the ground, so that they actually show that they're solving a real problem for real people and there is a market around it, and then to also validate their business model on that so that they can show this can actually work on a scale as well, and we can sustainably drive the climate impact that we want to see. And so, for example, our model at Circle Innovation of innovation and startup support is deeply anchored in human-centered design and co-creation principles and approaches for that reason, because we see major successes in moving innovators and startups we work with towards the traction that they need to show for investors to then actually invest in them. And the reason why is that it moves away from theoretical concepts and a pure focus on capacity building, maybe around entrepreneurship principles. That's an important part as well, but it adds to that by taking the teams to the field, showing how focusing on their customers, on their users is really critical in order for them to both build an innovation, build a product, a service that is solving a problem for real people versus just being a really good idea in a boardroom. Building traction with these people, because only if they're willing to use it, only if they're willing to pay for it, there is a business there. And then be able to slowly, step by step, build a business model around it in a structured, evidence-based approach. And so with that, startups can actually build traction early, and that's what investors want to see. They want to see, do you have revenues? What is your kind of growth rate in terms of acquiring customers, in terms of acquiring users? And so human-centered design and co-creation plays a really important part in that. I think in addition, so that was for the startup side. For the investor side, I think co-creation is a critical tool to bring together a wide range of stakeholders, of partners, of investors, funders, to foster strong partnerships. And so, for example, in the Circularity Launchpad now that we are currently implementing, supported by Andy and the IKEA Foundation, co-creation is at the center of how we're bridging the gap between circularity SMEs on the one hand side, who are looking for early stage funding, all within kind of the space of $20,000 to $50,000 mostly, but are still perceived as really high risk by investors, which is why kind of these investments are not flowing into that direction. And so we, on the other hand, are engaging investors who are interested in funding circularity SMEs, but might not know where to start and how to overcome that risk that they are perceiving. And so we engage them in different co-creation sessions to explore either, are there opportunities for matchmaking with the current cohorts by just breaking down maybe what does investment readiness mean? What do you need to see as an investor? And can we actively work with these businesses in order to get them to a point where you say, yes, I can do that investment. That fits within my mandate, fits within my thesis, and this is a good investment for me to do, by just kind of bridging the knowledge gap, so to say, and bringing light into something that seems still obscure and not very transparent. So that's one piece of it. And the second piece of it is, can we co-create and explore co-designing and piloting of innovative finance mechanisms that can then bridge the gaps we are seeing if the current instruments are actually not able to move into the space where clearly most of the circularity SMEs are at the moment. And so this is then more about co-creating with investors who deeply understand climate finance, who deeply understand impact finance, to see who can we partner with, who can we bring on board to maybe subsidize, de-risk some of these investments early on, now that the ecosystem is still in kind of its infancy and still maturing, to then crowd in more commercial capital that then can kind of really bring these businesses up to scale their impact. And so I think co-creation and human-centered design is really, really critical to help communities access and then also use climate finance well. Critical to scale up local climate innovations and resilience projects. And I think we're not seeing enough of it. I think we're still seeing a very siloed, isolated approach of different initiatives trying to do different or also the same things, not really exchanging, not really coming together, not really looking at how can we partner to bring our skills and our approaches to the table, but then as a sum be much more effective than we can be alone. And so I think there is a wide range of partnerships that we actually need to scale up local climate resilience projects, from entrepreneurship support organizations, among themselves partnering, exchanging lessons, looking at where are they supporting and what part in the journey, and how can they actually come together to make the support more effective. But then also between entrepreneurship support organizations and investors, other funders, philanthropic foundations, there's huge potential for partnerships to be able to identify the right type of technical support and the right type of financial support, and how both also go together. And so, especially when we're talking about climate resilience innovations and startups, there are different type of support, both technical and financial, that is required throughout the life cycle of a startup, from idea generation to scale and then maybe exit. And so now looking at climate finance, I think it's really critical to explore that blended finance approaches that can provide patient capital needed to launch and validate climate impact solutions before they can then de-risk it and crowd in more commercial capital that then can deploy the capital needed to scale these innovations in the market. The climate resilient startup ecosystem, as I said earlier, is still fairly nascent and new, and therefore investments in climate startups generally are perceived as very risky. And we're seeing it in the circularity space. So, for example, a study that Andy published last year highlighted how investors are still shying away from investing in circularity startups due to the capital intensive business models. And I think that's actually also applicable across the climate space, as well as the perceived high risk. And so I think partnerships between philanthropic funders and impact investors, more commercial investors, are critical to bridge this financing gap. But I think intermediaries such as entrepreneurship support organizations who are actively working with startups at the early stages also play a critical role to develop, pilot, and scale innovative blended finance into climate startups that can then really drive the impact that we all want to see in the ecosystem. I think there are a myriad of challenges that climate innovators and startups are facing in accessing adequate, I guess, financing that they need at this point in time. And as you said, one is that there is a mismatch between the type and amount of capital available in the market and what the early stage startups we support need. So, for example, in our Circularity Launchpad cohort, we see that most of the cohort companies are looking for financing between 20 and 50,000 US dollars in a mix of grant, loans, and equity. However, the funding available in the market starts at $100,000, often actually higher, maybe more, $250,000, $500,000. And so there is very limited capital available to actually bring these startups to a point where they can absorb the capital that is actually available in the market. But in addition to that, I think on the side of the startups, there's definitely this piece around investment readiness. But when I say investment readiness, what does that actually mean, right? So we are using these terms, but now in our work with the Circularity Launchpad, talking to different investors, looking at the different types of capital that the startups are looking at, investment readiness can mean very different things depending on kind of their journey, the type of capital that they're looking at, and also the investor that they are talking to. And so we're trying to bridge this gap on the one hand side by working with the businesses and really, okay, getting their financial systems in order, audited accounts, establishing strong governance structures, establishing boards, and decision-making processes that are just sound for investors, develop robust impact frameworks. And I think I touched on that. So to enable the startups to better communicate how they're driving the impact that they're driving and have the actual data and numbers ingrained in their model so that they can always report on that, as well as, of course, fundamentals like traction, revenues, customers, and growth that we need to see for investors to actually see this as a high potential solution. And I think a last point I just want to make is how can we use traditional existing channels of financing, such as banks, for example, who at the moment have impossible requirements, such as you need to have a title deed in order to access a loan, to make that asset class available for climate finance for these startups who often are looking for debt financing. And of course, we can talk about the high interest rates. That's another problem. But the core problem to start with is to actually access these loans without the collateral needed. And so I think these are some of the challenges that we're seeing and that we're actively working towards solving together with the different partners that we're engaging, because we definitely can't do